Welcome back. So in this final section, talking about the Incas, we're going to be talking about the expansion of Tawantinsuyo, the expansion of the empire, and how the state, the imperial state, was organized. And you'll see how that links to the cosmovision as this session continues. So if we start with the expansion, then it began with a war, as most imperial expansions do. And this war was against the people, or a group of peoples known as the Chancas. And we think this was the late 1430s European calendar. Now, Conrad and Demarest, who I mentioned earlier, they specifically cite the date of 1438. But I'd suggest we apply these dates, or specific dates, with caution, given the fact that the Incas left no written records. So what we know is really a mixture of what's often not too precise archaeological data and also historical memory written down many years after the events took place. So yeah, treat dates with caution. Alright, so piecing things together, the Chancas appear to have been a conglomerate of a number of ethnic groups, and altogether they're warlike, they're bellicose, and they're possibly responsible, at least in part, for the collapse of the Wari hegemony, who I mentioned earlier on. So this is the hegemony that existed prior to the Incas taking over the region. And the Chancas attacked Cusco, and most of the inhabitants of the city fled, but some, under the war leader Cusco stayed to defend the city. Now, Cusco had a vision that predicted that the Incas would be victorious, and also named him the son of the sun. Sorry, the sun as in the kind of child of, and the sun as in the flaming mass that gives us heat and life. So he's the son of the sun, and he's also the grandson of the creator deity Viracocha, who's obviously the father of the sun. So yeah, Cusco rallies those who remained and stayed to defend the city. Importantly, of course, before the battle, the Incas chose pretty good strategic positions. But the tide of the battle was turned by the Pururaucas, and these are stones that turn into warriors, both male and female. Remember the importance of female warriors, women like Mamacocha, and they saved the Incas at a critical moment of the fighting. So this is a legend, again I'm not too fond of that word, perhaps an oral history, better said, that's widely disseminated across the Andes, and you can interpret this in a number of ways. So our starting point is that of the Andean perspective. The stones came alive and they helped the Incas win. What does that mean? Well, these are spiritual forces of the very landscape that declare themselves for the Incas and enable their victory. That's the Andean perspective. It's not about signifying anything, it's what happened. Now, that leads us on to our second interpretation, that the intervention of the Pururaucas had further implications, and this intervention gave the Incas legitimacy and permanence in the region. So the very stones, these are the most permanent parts of the landscape, the rocks, they're animated and they side with the Incas. The Incas therefore become linked to or allied with that very permanence that's embedded in the rocks. The Incas become the permanent, legitimate rulers of the area. So you might then think, okay, well, how else might we interpret it? Well, a more prosaic, a secular interpretation that's more in keeping with the empirical historical analysis that you might be used to, it also highlights the historical importance of this particular moment, but it obviously interprets it slightly differently. It suggests that the Incas were helped at the last minute by new warrior groups that were waiting on the kind of hilltops to find out which way the battle was going to go, and they throw themselves in at the last minute. I mean, you can see that in any period of history, any region, that's what tends to happen. I mean, if we go back to English history, I think that's more or less what happened with the Tudors and the Wars of the Roses. So the Lancastrians and the Yorkists were fighting it out, and then all of a sudden Henry Tudor, who's waiting on the sidelines, waiting to find out which way the battle's going to go, he throws himself into the battle and ends up taking the crown. So I mean, this is a common practice, this is a common strategy. If you're not really too sure who's going to win, the best thing is to side with the winners. Ultimately, of course, it's a difficult balance, because you've got to come in early enough that the winners are thankful for your aid. If you come in too late, they'll just be like, yeah, well, you're just siding with us because we won. But you also don't want to come in too late. Conversely, you don't want to go in too early and come in on the wrong side, on the losing side, of course, because that'll make you a loser too. Anyway, so yeah, the tide of the battle is turned by the Pururaucas, and crucially, Cuzco captures the Chanca Malki, that's the mummy, remember, of Usobilca. And this is an immediate victory for the Incas, because it's a victory over the Chanca deities. Again, that should indicate to us the importance of the interconnectedness of Andean peoples and their gods. When the god is defeated and controlled by the enemy, so are the people. So he changes his name to Pachacutec, and that means cataclysm, turning over. It indicates a new beginning after massive destruction, and things get in motion from there. And that brings us on to the expansion. Now, there's two camps in the scholarly community, broadly headed by Konrad and Demarest on the one hand, and Rostorowski, who I've mentioned earlier, also on the other. Now, Konrad and Demarest take the line that the expansion was religiously motivated, and I put that in inverted commas, whereas Rostorowski argues that it's socially motivated. The problem is you can't really separate the two, and I wouldn't recommend it. You probably shouldn't try, because my point about the interconnectedness of spiritual forces and humans is still, for me, I think, the key point. In actual fact, these social and religious interpretations shouldn't be used in opposition to each other. And I don't necessarily think that Konrad and Demarest or Rostorowski or the scholars that follow them, I don't think they necessarily do either. They're not using them in opposition to each other. It's just a question of emphasis. What do they emphasize more? I'd suggest that neither extremes sufficiently bring to the fore the agency of the gods themselves, who work through the people, and also the vice versa, the people who work through the gods. But that's something that we can draw out more in the seminars, perhaps. Here, what I'm going to do is just briefly run through these two key arguments by these eminent scholars. So all agree that Inca expansion was very rapid and massive. So it began roughly under 1438 under Pachacutec, Cuzco, who became Pachacutec, and it roughly ended in 1525 with the death of Huayna Capac to smallpox, we think, and the empire collapsed then with a subsequent civil war and the arrival of the Spaniards in 1532. It probably wouldn't have collapsed had the Spanish not arrived. But the civil war plus the arrival of the Spanish provoked a series of events and alliances that gave rise to quite a bitter conflict and catastrophic collapse of Tawantinsuyo. So yeah, so it's rapid, the expansion, and it's very, very large. And the religious expansion theory, it centers on the notion of something called split inheritance. And I'll explain that now, because what it means is, if you have a dead Inca, I mentioned in the previous session that he continues to rule his kinship group, or she actually continues to rule her kinship group, the Panaca. The new Inca, and as time progressed, they were from Pachacutec onwards, they were all male actually. So yeah, I'll use the male pronouns. The new Inca received no material legacy from his predecessor, because the dead Inca is still ruling the kinship group, and that has a strange, to us at least, a strange effect that the deceased emperor's palaces, lands, servants are still his property. And what happens is they're entrusted to the stewardship of his Panaca, whilst ownership remains vested in the dead king, the Malki, the mummy. And members of the Panaca, they receive support through their ancestors' generosity. The continuing income that comes into the Panaca is redistributed amongst the Panaca members. Remember what I said the group's purpose was? Well, it's to serve as the dead king's court, maintain his mummy, and to perpetuate his cult. And that continues things the way they were. So Pachacutec, he's the Inca that defeated the Chancas. He reorganizes a system. It's not just the old Panacas that claim descent from the Ayar siblings now. He also creates new Panacas for the leaders who assisted him in the fight against the Chancas, the ones who came on side with enough time to warrant thanks from Pachacutec. And he gives them lands for their support. But there is a huge problem in that what the mummies of the dead Incas owned meant that the new Inca, this is Pachacutec, has no property as such. So what he's got to do is acquire wealth very quickly. Now, when I say wealth, it's important to bear in mind that the way we understand wealth can be quite different to the way it was understood in the Andes. Wealth in the Andes is not so much, well, it's not at all monetary wealth. There's no coinage or things like that. Even gold isn't wealth, so in the way that Europeans and would understand it. Gold is valuable for the fact that it represents the divinity of the sun, not because it has monetary value. So wealth in the Andes is in labor. So what that means is the time spent by commoners working for the Inca in producing food, clothing, buildings, wool, infrastructure, etc, etc, etc. If I'm the Inca and I have stuff, it's not that so much that makes me wealthy, it's the fact that all these people are working for me and producing the stuff. The reason I'm wealthy then is because I can then redistribute it. But we'll come to that when I talk about reciprocity. So yeah, dead Incas, they tie up land and labor. So the land belongs to the dead Incas, and also the people who work those lands for the dead Incas. So the conquest of new territory is the only way for a new Inca to acquire wealth for subsequent Panacas. And at the same time, because the persona of the Inca Emperor, or the Sapa Inca, that's the supreme Inca, is subsumed in that of the sun deity. Remember, the Pachacutec is the son of the sun. All other regional cults have to take second place to the cult of the sun, and hence the royal cult of the Inca. The cult of the sun is what provides the glue that binds the empire together, whilst the cult of the dead seemingly gave the impetus for continued expansion. So that is the split inheritance argument, the argument about religious driven expansion by Konrad and Demrest. But that brings us on to the theory of reciprocity that's put forward by Rostorowski. So if we think about Andean society, or the Andean system, the Inca can't just levy taxes as kings did in Europe. There needs to be a system of reciprocity. So the Inca needs lands to produce goods to redistribute in return for labor. So, for example, if I'm the Inca and I want somebody to do something for me, like produce wool from llamas or llamas, I need to give that person, or that community more like, something in return. So I need to, if I have stuff, I can give out some of my stuff to create obligations with the people who receive my stuff. But the only way to collect all this is through conquest. So reciprocity is a way of organizing a society with an economy that doesn't use money. Now, if we go back to the Inca triumph over the Chancas, Pachacutec does acquire great military prestige. So he can count on many allies. So, for example, just after the victory, if Pachacutec says, right, I'm the leader, nobody's going to really dispute that, because he's just won a massive victory over some very bellicose people. And you don't want to tell somebody who's in a position of power like that they're a nobody. You don't do that. But at the same time, he doesn't possess absolute or direct dominion over the other lords. So he can't order them to order their people to carry out public works, and he can't order people to carry out public works directly without the approval and support of their own local lords. He doesn't have the workforce, and he can't command it directly without the agreement of his neighbours. So authority isn't exercised directly, it's exercised by means of reciprocity, and there's a word to describe that called minka, or minka kuni, which means to beg someone to help me, permitting something in return. I mean, ritually you could say it was to beg someone to help me, but I think in practice there's more of an expectation than somebody plaintively begging for help. Yeah. Anyway, so Pachacutec carries out large, relatively speaking, public works in Cusco after his victory. He's the victor, he rules Cusco, and he wants to build it up. Fair enough. But how does he do this? Because any work that he wants done has to be requested and begged from, and inverted commas, from the neighbouring lords, so that they can do the same with their people, and the people would come and work. How did Pachacutec get around this problem? Well, what he does is he invites the lords to Cusco, he gives them presents, he gives them food, so he feasts, wines and dines them, well, not with wine, obviously, with chicha, that's maize beer, for days and days, and only then can he present his request and ask for cooperation. So in order to do this, what he needs to possess great quantities of gifts, so food, luxury objects, coca, for rituals, and also for giving strength. Now, there was a large amount of booty after the defeat of the Chancas, so he has that already. Pachacutec can redistribute, and did redistribute, the lands around the city, but what he does then is order a storage facilities constructed and a fortress. He's astute enough to realise that this war booty which he's redistributing won't last forever. So in essence, I mean, once he's redistributed, that's it really. There's not going to be another group of people like the Chancas who are coming to Cusco to overthrow the Incas. Quite the opposite. He's going to have to go out and find it. So yeah, In essence, Pachacutec requests help and cooperation, and the lords agree. But bear in mind these requests always have limits. They've got to be within the bounds of ritually established norms. So if, as the conquests widen, because the Incas are going out and finding new peoples to conquer, new peoples to bring into their territories, new lands, and new peoples to work those lands to produce the stuff that they're going to redistribute. So as these conquests continue, or if the request isn't formulated properly, then there's always the risk that the lords who are having this requested of them would reject the request, and the Incas then obliged to be even more generous. And as time went on, this led to greater tensions. In that, as the Inca grows in power, he felt constrained by reciprocity. Or as the Incas grow in power, then they start to feel constrained by reciprocity. So just as an example, at the very end of the Inca Empire, Huayna Capac, he's at war with the Cayambis of the north. So this is in what is now Ecuador. The Inca needs reinforcements, so Huayna Capac needs reinforcements. So this is around the 1520s, shall we say, just before the Spanish got there. Just before Huayna Capac died, in fact. And he orders them into battle. He needs reinforcements, and he orders into battle an army that's just arrived from the south. And the generals are his kin. They're his cousins, his brothers. Not quite clear what precise relationship is, but they're his kinfolk. And they get there. It's really urgent. He's hard pressed, and so he just orders them into battle, without the ritual of reciprocity and requests for gifts. So the general-in-chief and the Inca nobles, what do? Well, they set out, they turn around, and they start marching back to Cusco. Huayna Capac, he doesn't take things lying down, by the way. He's told of the desertion. Instead of going after them and court-martialing them for desertion, as Europeans might do, what he does is he dispatches gifts, and then they return and they fight. It wasn't the generals who were at fault for the desertion, it was Huayna Capac for not following the proper customs of reciprocity. So yeah, that's how reciprocity worked, and how it was or didn't work towards the end, and how important it was for the growth of the empire. So I'll sum it all up now, and there are a number of things to bear in mind. The first thing is, leaving aside the problems of interpretation of Spanish texts that are written by the chroniclers, that in turn, in the large part, fail to understand what it was that they were documenting, so the Spanish didn't really know how the Inca systems work, how Inca time worked even. Notwithstanding that, attempts to access the Inca past can tell us a few things at least about their cosmovision, and understanding things about their cosmovision can help us tell some things about the Inca past. The two things work in tandem. Now, last time when we talked about the Huarochirí, I warned you about reductionism, which is basically grouping all these different groups all together in one basket. Now, despite my warnings last time about reductionism, there are cosmological and cultural traits that are common to various ethnic groups in the Andes. What do you have? You've got the ever-presence of dualities. Also, you've got the relationship between particular groups and their ancestor deities. This is of prime importance. But this relationship between particular groups and their ancestor deities also gives us the necessary difference for conflict, because they've got different ancestor deities who emerged from different holes in the caves. That gives us a difference that allows for conflict and ultimately imperial expansion. The final thing to mention is that the cult of the dead, as it developed amongst the Inca, as part of the concept of life-giving reciprocity, necessitated expansion to bring in more resources for continual reciprocity. So that's both a social and a religious interpretation. At the same time, you've got the cult of the sun, which provides an overarching state cult that deifies the Inca emperor and places him in a position of authority not only over the conquered peoples of the empire, but also over their huacas, their deities, because he's the son of the sun, who's the supreme deity. And that means that he can, like Kusiupanki, order, or Pachakutek rather, order the huacas to assist him in further conquests, as we saw with Macawisa when we talked about the Huarachiri. Okay, so that's where I'll leave the session on the Incas. Thank you very much.